I am the youngest. I have four older brothers. We got kind of grew up in it was like a very religious but kind of more hippie style hybrid community. But definitely grew up pretty rough, pretty rural, pretty rough, dealing with a lot of the challenges that come along with, being kind of in an isolated community and, off the map outside of Arlington, Washington. So really like rural farm country. We had our own organic farm and yurts. We lived in yurts. So it was very like off-grid type, and faith-based, like Judeo-Christian faith, mixed with free love 60s kind of strange hybrid. It was very strange. Years later, I, was able to recognize it's a little bit of a cult, in the way that sometimes when a group gets really small and insulated, they can behave strangely. And part of the reason that we were connected is because that experience brought me to advocacy work, advocating for domestic violence and sexual assault advocacy and doing work to kind of improve the lives of young people and families that are toxic, those kinds of things. I left when I was 14. One of my brothers and I, traveled to Eastern Washington, had a couple other siblings living over there, and I finished my high school years out there and then applied for college and got a full ride to Evergreen. And so ended up in Olympia and kind of stayed in the area ever since.
When we talked earlier, one of the things you were telling me about is observing your brothers, some struggles that they had, including in relationships and maybe self-esteem things, and domestic violence, even in their own situations. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's always like, I always struggle with that piece of wanting to tell my own story and, wanting to protect the people I love and everything. But I do think that there's, one of the things that I really appreciate about the work that you've done or, the little bit that I know of, right? We just are meeting, but is this piece around, what I would have kind of normally refer to like, mental health or resources for men specifically. I've always grown up really like connecting to my brothers and really loving them and supporting them and being very close with them. And I grew up in the kinds of communities that, you can see everyone is hurting, right? Like there's all different kinds of harm and struggle going on. But I think just witnessing specifically the challenges that young men face in kind of that conditioning process of like, you should be strong, you should be the provider, you should, be able to kind of be independent at a very young age and be responsible for so much more at a very young age, and the way that created this struggle to, love themselves, I think, and be able to work through things that were bothering them, like the shutting down of emotional processing. There's so much more physical violence that I think young men face. Whereas like, young women or girls often face that like coercive and manipulative and kind of a different flavor of violence. I think that the violence that men face um tends to be, it's more common that there's a lot of physical violence that comes along with it, or types of like fracturing from self. Whereas like, women are encouraged to come together and talk through things and solve things. There's this push for men to close off and isolate and contain. I think that it really destroys the ability to seek support, or to know who to reach out to when you're struggling. And I think I saw that in a lot of the men that I grew up around, including my brothers, this like feeling like they should handle it all on their own and feeling like they should be completely perfect and functional, even though all of us struggle, right? Like every single person struggles in life. And a lot of young people experience violence. They experience something problematic, whether it's from a mentor or from somebody in their family, or if it's in school, right? There's always things that we face as young people in our more vulnerable years of our life. And I think that there's a lot less support for men. And I think that that is kind of something that people can feel a little bit controversial about. Like if you say like there's a lot less support for men in that area, people are, don't want to come across as being like anti-feminist. I consider myself um a feminist, like I definitely support women and believe in women's rights and have fought very hard for women in spaces as well. But I think that just because uh, there's like a house on fire doesn't mean that there's other houses that aren't on fire. Like, and that um, we need to create space for the full conversation. Like, we need to create space for talking about men's health and men's mental health and support for men and young boys when it comes to domestic violence, sexual violence. Like, there's such a void of dialogue, and I think it's hurting everyone. But it's definitely hurt people that I love in my life a lot. And I see even with my son, kind of as he is growing up and watching the way that there's this breaking from himself that is encouraged and pushed um, and expected. It definitely has pushed me to try to have more of those conversations with my brothers, try to figure out how they are supporting themselves, how they are healing, how they are growing so that I can do it for my kiddo, because I don't have that same experience of being socialized male, of growing up as a boy. And so it's like it's difficult to know when you've had some experience of being put into that masculine role as a trans person. I feel like I have some experience of being viewed masculine, being perceived that way, but it's not the same. And so kind of just trying to catch up with that as a parent of a boy.
Between your observations of your brothers, other men in your life, and then your own son, I'm thinking about how I heard someone say that it's more of a men's mentality to avoid talking about problems because that's an act of kindness. It's an act of not burdening another person with what's ailing you. I'm always curious about the nature and the nurture aspect of what causes people to be the way they are. Is that something that interests you?
Definitely. I mean, I think I'm always, especially being, so I identify as non-binary. As you can see from my name, after there I have they, them. Um, those are the pronouns I use. And I feel like I'm always very fascinated by nature versus nurture because I get to experience this like little in-between space that a lot of people don't get to see, and just the ways that when you're kind of deconstructing your own gender, you can see the way that it's constructed around other people. And I think that there's definitely those innate things about ourselves, right? Like I remember when my partner, my ex-husband and I were raising our child, and we wanted to be everything gender neutral when he was growing up and wanted to make sure he could choose his own path and everything. And like, he chose the expected path, I guess, that society would have for him. And he's very much like grounded in that and just who he is. And it was a funny thing to see, like, him be so like truck and, boots and I don't know, like just like all the things that are these like stereotypical things that boys like, superheroes, things like that, that just were he was naturally inclined to. And I feel like even when he presented with all the options, and I feel like it's easy for people who don't have a good experience with their gender growing up to think that it's all taught, socialized, it's all nurture. And I don't think that's true. I just don't know what the line is, right? Like it's not, but I think that there are influences. And I think one of the ways that like we can have people pleasers, right? I definitely think I'm a people pleaser, right? Like you can have people pleasers of all genders, people who are just trying to make other people happy. But the way that we're taught to please can be different based on our gender as or our perceived genders as we're kids, right? Like, and I think that men are taught that in order to be a good man, right? To do a good job as a man, you should take care of others. But the ways that you should take care of others, right, is to not burden them with yourself, right? It's that like independence. It's that you should be completely self-sufficient and self-sustained, and you should take care of other people by providing resources, by providing shelter, by working hard, those kinds of things, right? Whereas if you're perceived as a woman, if you're raised as a woman, you are taught that you should caretake the emotions. Like you should do all the emotional labor for your partner, make sure that he has a good relationship with his family, that he has a good, that he thinks of his mother's birthday, which is, kind of ridiculous, right? You see this happen all the time in society, right? Where there's the wife is like, I bought your mom a present and I did this, and this and the husband's like, oh, you take care of all that. I don't have any opinions about the home or you know it's silly in those ways, right? Like that's just a funny thing that we can laugh about and people, make all kinds of jokes about. But the more serious aspects of that is that, you leave men emotionally isolated. You don't need to reach out to your mom. I've got it. You don't need to take care of the kids. I've got it. You don't need to be paying attention to these things. And in almost a way you shouldn't be because it's less manly, right? And it harms both people in the relationship, right? I don't think that you hear all the time about how unhappy women are in their marriages because there's not this equity or partnership. And so what you end up having is like you have society like forcing people into these very regimented roles. And it's harming both of them, but it's an expectation that we put on people. Where I get really curious is like around watching people find new ways of creating equity in relationships and new ways of going about having relationships and hoping that through my own healing and my own work around mental health that I can have conversations with my family and when they're feeling isolated or struggling, I will have conversations with my brothers. I've been able to like kind of bridge that gap and be an emotional support for them. Just saying, like, have you had this conversation with your partner? It's amazing how often when you say that, when somebody's sharing with you and you say, have you had this conversation with your partner? How often that they haven't, right? That they haven't opened up, going off on a whole tangent now, but like we don't know how to communicate to each other. We don't know how to have dialogue unless through friendship sometimes, right? That's the best we can do. But I think even that for men, a lot of men are not encouraged to have those kinds of relationships with their friends, even. I feel like so many men are a mystery to the people in their lives. Like I really do. I feel like people don't know how. Like so many of my friends, I have a lot of male friends, and I feel like so many of my female friends are like, um, or even just women identified friends are like, I don't know how to talk to men. I don't know how to have this conversation. I can't talk to my brother. I can't talk to my father. There's no connecting or like even their husbands. Like I can't get him to talk about this thing. And I think that is a really clear indication that something really harmful is happening because uh, we're not that different as a species, as creatures. We're not that different. Men and women are just there can be vast differences, but mostly it's like how we express our gender, how flamboyant we are or not, like those kinds of things, like whether we enjoy being homebodies or whether or not we're adventurous, those are the things that are different and nuanced, but we all communicate. We all have mental health issues. We all have hopes and dreams, like, and we need to learn how to talk to each other about it so we can be there for each other.
If I'm not mistaken, it was 10 years ago or maybe more that you worked for a domestic violence and sexual assault services organization. My experience, and I'm public about having experienced domestic violence from my ex-wife
Hmm.
around 2017, 2018. As I'm involved in this advocacy for boys and men and connecting with domestic violence services organizations, I'm hearing that there's some growing desire to be inclusive, like fully inclusive towards men, towards male identified victims and survivors who genuinely, are deserving of services like somebody of anyone, yeah, of any other gender or sex. So I'm curious to ask what you observed back then and whether you think there's truth to this idea that there's growing desire to be inclusive towards men.
Yeah, I think that a lot of the organizations that serve people who are experiencing domestic violence were started kind of in the days where it was they called them battered women shelters, right? It was for women fleeing marriage. I mean, that was like kind of the whole design was like women fleeing marriage and they're experiencing domestic violence. Um, and so the whole model like did not contemplate men at all. You know, people will get kind of like again, sometimes, like I said earlier, 'cause people can get weird about when you talk about men's rights or talk about like serving men or supporting men that like can get like very, well, we have this other worse fire over here we're trying to fight. And um, but I think that, the one thing that I would always say to try to get people to kind of adjust their perspective is like, okay, so you have a 15-year-old boy who's being beaten up by his dad, right? Everyone can, that's an easy model for people to accept. They're like, "Oh, we've all seen that." You know. And it's like, where does that boy go? There's nowhere for them right now. You have a few homeless youth shelters, which is a very different demographic than just a kiddo who is experiencing violence in his home, right? So when you have a women's only shelter, right, that there's no placement for that young person. And then you can kind of get more nuanced, right, where you can start to actually explain that there are people like, we would experience a dad with his kids, fleeing a domestic violence situation and we'd have no place, right? And so what you'd have to do is you'd have to look at, okay, do we have any money for a hotel room? As the more we understand about research that like psychological abuse is far more detrimental than physical abuse, just as far as like how long it will stay with you and the things that it will do, right? The wounds heal, but those mental scars are sometimes the things that we carry with us forever. The more that we see that in research, the more that we're recognizing that, I think the more that advocates who are working in domestic violence are recognizing that this is something that everyone is experiencing. And so the more I do think that that conversation is happening of we don't have gosh, we don't have anyone here who's a man who can have a conversation with another man who's feeling anxious about having a conversation with a woman about experiencing domestic violence. Like things like that. We were starting to have those conversations, and there were a few men who were working at this was Safe Place, Safe Place of Olympia. Who were trying to create that conversation, which was very difficult to have in that space. I think it's probably why I keep coming back to like saying like I know people feel very sensitive about this. I know that there can be a lot of misconceptions about it because that's what I experienced in those spaces is that like that especially for people who maybe were of an older generation, they couldn't understand how um agency and power dynamics work today. In the past, when, a woman couldn't have a bank account, she couldn't have a driver's license. I mean, there was just so much that like women weren't even legally allowed to do. And that is when those shelters were created, was in a time that those kinds of things were taking place. And so it's
So
just a very different
so that would
uh,
be like a genuine lack of power and ability to control one's fate. Whereas contrast that with today, and that's no longer the case.
that's no longer the case. One of the things I think around, talking about domestic violence in transmasculine people experiencing domestic violence, um, is that like agency is about like how much power you have in a certain dynamic or space, I feel like, right? Where that's not a complete definition, but where it's like in a relationship, you have to look at like my previous relationship was very, very complicated. I had a very abusive dynamic in a past relationship, well, several, honestly, because I just grew up around that. And I definitely found it normal to be treated poorly in a relationship and even thought like that's what love looks like. If somebody's really passionate and possessive and controlling, that means they love you. And and not really, not well. That's not like what love looks like, you know? Um, but I think that, for me, it was like, okay, you kind of had to look at the situation, like who has the money, right? That's one um that can convey agency in a relationship, who has control of the purse strings, who can finance things, who can get an apartment or get a hotel room if they need to leave, right? Is there any exit strategy? Do you have a driver's license? Does your partner have a driver's license? Who has the car, right? Like all of these things are you can start to look at the nuance and complexity. Who has, does somebody have a relationship with a local law enforcement versus somebody who doesn't have a relationship with the local law enforcement? Does somebody have the skills to ask for help? Those are things that like we're starting to I think a lot of folks who are advocating for like advocates in domestic violence work are starting to look at and see how can we start to look at those like the overall relationship and the power balance in that relationship versus just coming in and being like, well, one person needs to be arrested, it's going to be the man.
When you were working for a safe place back then, did you see any difference in like the intake process, assumptions that were made based on the person's gender or sex who was calling?
The unfortunate thing is I don't think many people made it that far. Right? I mean, you just saw it in the call volumes, which if based on my own personal experience, and personal experience is just anecdotal, I realize this, but I know, I have relationships with people from all over the, political spectrum, from all over the state, and from all different genders and walks of life. And what I've seen is that like people are experiencing violence in kind of equal not equal, but I mean, it's like there's, I definitely do think there's a cultural norm to be controlling of a woman, right? Like there's definitely that cultural norm, but that doesn't mean that there's not plenty of people experiencing violence regardless of gender. And I think that the number of calls that you get supporting men in like on the domestic violence lines, on the crisis lines, all of that is very indicative of the fact that there's still not enough support for people to feel safe to reach out. What I saw is that we would have a lot of advocates reaching out on behalf of men. There was this gentleman I knew who ran a support group for men in Tacoma, Washington. What he found in facilitating that group was that there was so much that people were going through. And so he would reach out and he'd be like, I have somebody who's experiencing domestic violence. It's clear, like he's being hit. His wife just hits him, like thinks it's okay. He doesn't think he thinks he's a bad person because he can't deal with it. He can't deal with her even if you can physically conquer somebody, that's not who we are. Like that's not who people are. You're not just going to be like, okay, somebody's hitting me, so I hit back. Like most of the time, what I see and what I've seen in the people that I love is like, especially for the men in my life, is that when they're hit, they take it and they think that that's what they should do. And then the intake process, I think, is definitely just, refer them somewhere else because there wasn't services. And there's not really anywhere to refer other than, okay, we'll get you a space to stay, but there's not a lot of support. And I definitely think that, again, just in the experiences that I've had, trying to be really thoughtful about how I talk about some of my personal relationships with men and what they've been through. But, I just, witnessing somebody who's very kind and very soft and very gentle, being arrested by law enforcement, even though, the, you know, like his windows are shot out and he's stabbed in the leg. It's like that's pretty extreme. And I think that that is something that our laws are struggling to address is like how do we navigate supporting people through domestic violence when we don't have a clear picture when we arrive on the scene, but we don't fully know what's going on and how do we navigate this. And I think there's a lot of room for improvement there. But I think right now I'm just trying to figure out how do we support people even coming forward, because I think that's still part of the conversation is that people don't know how to come forward.
In my experience, I did have a level of awareness and confidence that I would be treated properly and helped, such that I did call the National Domestic Violence Hotline once, and I also called the University of Washington's like student crisis hotline because I was a enrolled student at UW at the time. But I didn't have it didn't occur to me that there'd be organizations who are like funded with taxpayer dollars to help people in my exact situation, and that I could have gone and asked for services because I did sleep in my car. I did sleep in my band's practice space, and that's an example of something that there's taxpayer funded services, I think, and donor funded services to provide help for people in that situation. I think some of that was my exposure to just the concept of domestic violence being a matter of men mistreating women, and so not seeing myself in this role of someone who would be taking up those kinds of services.
Yeah, and we have like pamphlets in every, women's restroom and flyers posted on doors. And we talk to young girls about when they're going through, you break them apart and you have the sex ed conversations. At least when I was going through school, they still did that in Eastern Washington. And I'm pretty sure that the women were the only ones that were getting the talk about, what to do if you're being mistreated. I think we all need to be having those conversations with our kiddos about what it looks like to be loved fully and what love looks like and how to get help if that's not working, if somebody's mistreating you, what to do.